morning, good afternoon, good evening. How is everybody? Welcome to another episode of Roll Around, Find Out. In today's episode, I am once again honored to have another guest on the podcast. Author, designer, genius, Sam Sorenson. I have talked in the past that Mothership is my all-time favorite RPG system. It just checks all my boxes. Simple system, tons of flavor, percentile based, roll under, great community, third party resources. I can go on and on. To have Sam on was truly a pleasure. We talk about the development of Time After Time, the Kickstarter process, GM resources, and a multitude of other topics. Once again, honored to have another person give up their free time for a little old podcast. Without further ado, Sam Sorenson.
Welcome to the show, author of many titles, but most recently to me, Time After Time, Sam Sorenson. How are you?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Just briefly that we talked before, huge fan. I've got Time After Time printed out here, and when my D&D table is done, I'm going to convince my table to run Mothership, and I mean, it's this or Gradient Descent, but I'm going to lean heavily on Time After Time. This is an amazing work of art, I will say.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
How'd you get started in role-playing games?
Well, like just about everybody else, when I was in the 5th grade, my mom signed me up for the Dungeons and Dragons Club at middle school, and I went and played with my middle school art teacher, Mr. Bennett, and was then off and on for a few years until eventually when I got to college, I started playing and running more regularly, and from there got into design and writing and graphic design and other things and started making my own stuff.
I'm going to put a link in the description for your blot page.
Great.
And that goes into great detail.
Oh, yeah. I just did a long retrospective just sort of my own writing and style, thinking through all the stuff I've played. It was a little horrifying, if I admit it. It was a little scary to look back and be like, oh, God, how much time have I spent playing role-playing games?
Did you initially want to go to college to study game theory, game design, or that's just what landed in your lap?
Yeah. So I went to school to make video games, and then did that for an embarrassingly long time. And I realized pretty quickly that I am a pretty terrible programmer in most senses. And thus, well, there's lots of things you can do in video games that aren't programming, like the sort of more fundamental design stuff requires a certain technical skill set that while I could do it, was mostly like pulling teeth for me. And so instead I shifted more towards tabletop design and writing and kind of the stereotypical, like, couldn't hack it in video game programming, so went to other artsy fields story that you see.
Well, I think you're doing okay.
Sure hope so.
On your itch.io page, you mentioned that you do run professional tables.
A few, yeah.
Is that something that is ongoing right now?
No, I oftentimes just get hired just to do like one-off games. So I do one-shots for people's parties, or for like occasionally I've done like corporate training stuff where we'll use games and RPGs. But for the most part, my recurring games are just my regular old home games.
After D&D, I think I had read that you were a big Power by the Apocalypse fan.
Yeah. So I have a somewhat tumultuous RPG design history of, I feel like many people sort of set out to make one thing, they learn to make that thing, they do it pretty well. Whereas for me, I started, this was the 5e heyday. I started in 5e and then was making some 5e stuff for a while, and then eventually moved towards more story games. So I made PBTA games for a while. I made like fluffy narrative question and answer kinds of games, noodled around with like very, sort of like emotional, deep, sort of like, let's map human emotions onto stat blocks and use them to do interesting, exciting, emergent things. This was sort of like right when G+ was dying, sort of that era, like late 2010s. And then eventually I found the OSR, and I realized that while mapping emotions onto stats is fun, it's not always what I want out of a role-playing game. And these days I make stuff that is pretty squarely in the like old school post OSR kind of like minimalist stuff.
I think that's where Mothership probably falls under.
Yeah, for sure.
I started during COVID.
Oh, wow. You're a recent convert.
Yes. Yeah. I've always been a nerd. Magic the Gathering I was into in middle school. Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, that stuff I was really into. And then just like I'd go to the gaming store, and you know, those guys over there, they play D&D, but I play Magic. You know, and so I'd hear them and they're having a good time, and I just, you know, that I didn't have the friend group. But then COVID hit, everyone's on lockdown. I used to play video games as a kid, never really played video games. I had friends that they're all playing Madden online or whatever games online. But like, that doesn't scratch my itch. I don't want to get Xbox. And so I said, you know what, here's the time. I'm going to take the time to learn about Dungeons and Dragons. And long story long is I got two of my friends. Hey, we're all bored at home. Let's run and play once or twice a week. And now it's just become an obsession, a creative outlet. My library grows every week. It's I love it.
Yeah. Yeah. No, RPGs are like a magical sort of experience. And I think in particular in the pandemic, when it was like, when we were all so, I mean, both like literally, but also sort of like socio-emotionally distant from each other, I feel like the opportunity to hit this like recurring thing where we engage in this shared experience together that we have for each other, that is sort of a more unique standout experience. It was really unusual in the pandemic. You know, all of my games that I played during the pandemic are the ones that are still some of the most important ones to me that I've run.
If you had to pinpoint like the number one thing that draws you to the hobby, could you think of one thing?
Yeah, it's the playing in an imaginary space of it's saying, let's imagine that this place is real and let's see what we can do with it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Very cool. What was your introduction to Mothership?
Ooh, that's a good question. What was my introduction to Mothership? I remember, I honestly don't remember how I first heard about it, but it was right after Dead Planet released in the early days of Zero E. And I knew Jarrett Crater. I know Jarrett still. And so I think I heard about it from Jarrett somehow, that like he and Sean had made this cool thing. And so I remember looking at the PSG that was free at the time and being really impressed with the Zero E PSG. Like a lot of smart decisions. And I somehow got a hold of the old Pocket mod that Sean McCoy made originally, which is like just a little single, 8-fold piece of 8.5 by 11 paper, with like all the rules and the classes and like a little teeny tiny adventure built onto it. And then I read Dead Planet and was really struck of like Dead Planet was doing things with a zine that I had never seen a zine do before. And so from there, I remember, I backed both of the Kickstarters for Pound of Flesh and Gradient Descent during Zine Quest in like 2019, 2020, whatever that was. And from there, I started talking to people in the scene a little more, and running some Mothership. And then eventually in 2022, I decided to make my own, and that became Time After Time after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears.
I'm a Kickstart backer, so I appreciated all the updates. And while I don't have all the updates memorized, I'm pretty sure it was, you mentioned in there, it was almost like an 80% rewrite at one point.
Yeah. So I originally started working on Time After Time for a class I was taking in grad school. And I basically made a version for that class that was pretty close to what the Kickstarter said. It was about 36, maybe 40 pages long, and was quite a bit smaller than the final product. That version was, I think, total, like on one given instance of the timeline, I think was only about 30, 35 rooms, something like that. So it was a lot smaller, and it was a lot more compact if there were like all the timelines were on the same pages. So it was like a much different reading experience. And then I was running some playtests with that, and I was looking at what I had in my like PDF, and basically just realized it wasn't going to work. Like, you could play it, it was playable, but it was not challenging, it was not evocative, it was not gripping, it was too simple, it was too straightforward. And so after going through a lot more drafts, if I had like, probably like 1 or 2 dozen pages in my notebook of just like attempts at figuring out how to structure this whole adventure, I was talking with my editor Matt Kay, who's super talented, and eventually we sort of landed on the idea of like just going for a more kitchen sink sort of approach of really just throwing in most of what we could think of like, okay, let's just put the cool ideas in here. Let's not worry so much about tracking each individual time device, because that was a thing in one of the earlier drafts. Let's really focus on making each individual timeline its own, or each individual point in the timeline rather, like its own distinct adventure. Like one of the goals we really tried to hit is that whether you're early or middle or late, there are problems to solve and things to do and questions to be answered. And they do vary somewhat. The challenges that a crew will face late in the timeline when there's monsters running around and security officers is different than the middle of the timeline where everything's on lockdown and super locked up tight, versus the early timeline where there are far fewer devices and far more questions to be answered. And trying to, like, one of the things that Matthew, my editor, told me, what Matt said, that was really insightful is like, in an adventure like this that's about time travel, one of the critical elements is giving players reasons to bounce across the timeline. I think it's quite easy in a lot of these like multi-part dungeons to just make everything constrained to its one part, but the more connections and the more sort of reasons and like almost like impetuses you have to cross back and forth across different elements of the timeline, the more exciting and evocative and like out of control your adventure will get in a really cool way.
Backing up half a step.
Yeah, sorry, I realize I'm just monologuing here.
No, that was perfect. If you were to give like your elevator pitch of why somebody should play Time After Time, what's the premise of it?
Oh, sure. Yeah. So Time After Time, is a time travel mothership adventure that's about mind-bending puzzles and like reality crumbling around you and the horror of existential paradoxes. So in Time After Time, you will show up when the station is ruined, and then sooner or later go back in time to when this research station was still operational, and you'll chase NPCs in and out of weaving timelines. You'll use devices to exploit things. You'll create paradoxes of your own. It's all about like manipulating time in ways that twist and screw with your head.
Those paradoxes, when I was reading through, the only real connection I have is the family photo of Marty McFly and his family.
Exactly.
Just thinking of that, I thought, this is truly brilliant. And this is like, and I don't mean to like kiss your butt, but this is like an idea I would think of like, oh, this is really cool, but it's a lot of work. I'd never be able to execute it, but you did. And
yeah,
it's amazing.
It took a lot of work. Thank you. Yeah, it took a lot of work. There was a lot of like, at one point I was watching time travel movies and like taking notes. I was like, okay, this thing we can work in, this thing we can work in, this isn't going to work. This is a trick with cinematography that won't work written on the page. But it was a lot of like research and iteration of, I think, at least in terms of like on a conceptual level. I've had individual things and other projects that I've iterated through more times, you know, an individual monster, an individual room. But I think, guys, in terms of like the broad concepts of an adventure, and particularly the kind of like high level conceptual rules of Time After Time, I don't think I've ever iterated through quite so many times as we did with this project, which is why it took so long.
Well, the effort shows. This won't come across at all, me just holding this up, but I mean, people literally need to go and buy it. But just the color scheme, the layout, the design, the flow of the adventure. Probably this back page just shows. I can't even put the words right now. Making it all connect the three different timelines. It is a masterpiece.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I owe a lot of credit, truthfully, to the example that Sean McCoy set, Sean and Jarrett both, of, you know, Mothership pretty consistently is leading the charge in like how to use graphic design in your game design in the same way. You know, and I don't think, I mean, you look at something like Johan Noor on Morkborg, and like Johan is a wizard with graphic design, and he makes really beautiful books. But I think he does not, and this is not a dig against Johan, I mean, it's different goals, but I think Sean manages to use graphic design integrated into like game design in a way that I feel like I rarely see elsewhere. And so really it was looking at Sean's examples and reading through his blog posts that was a huge part of understanding how to make Time After Time.
Being mostly a 5e guy, you know, nothing wrong with that. There's a reason why it's the most popular role-playing game out there, but it is kind of just, you know, a sterile read.
Yeah.
You know, here's what this character does. Here's at these levels. Here are, you know, how to play. But yeah, when I first got a hold of Mothership, the character sheet flow chart, I mean, that's just how every role-playing game should be.
Yeah, totally.
Start here, work your way through, simple instructions, roll here, do this. Yeah. So the graphic design, perfect. I would say, I don't know if you drew inspiration from Gradient Descent, but
of course. Absolutely.
when I looked at this, I thought it flowed like just as well. And like this could, okay, I'm really kissing your butt, but
please, you invited me on the podcast. It's fine.
Like this should be like an official, like along with Gradient Descent, along with Dead Planet, like that fits in the family.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I would hope so. I would love to. Sean McCoy, if you're listening, please feel free.
Awesome. Did you back the 1E box set? Or...
of course, yeah. And I like bought the T-shirt and like the giant golden box. Yeah, of course. Like, how could I not?
Yeah, I've got the golden box right here. And when it arrived, I'll say, well, I already printed off all the PDF, so I don't really need the content on the inside. But it is a really nice box.
Oh, it's a lovely box. Oh yeah.
Awesome. I'm a very, very casual designer. Like start on Google Docs.
Oh yeah, that's how they all start.
Yeah, I got a couple things posted on Drive-Thru RPG. Walk me through your software process. What do you use?
Sure. Yeah. So I, by dint of at one point being a grad student and now being an adjunct instructor at a couple different universities means that I get free access to Adobe. So I use, to my shame, the Adobe suite primarily. But typically my workflow, my pipeline is I start with outlines, Google Docs, and I outline through stuff in my notebook on pen and paper. And then typically as I'm writing, I will work up like a sample page in InDesign or Photoshop of like what I kind of like want it to look like. And sometimes that even involves like drafting through like what a page would look like. I'll even just write one page just in InDesign and then port it over back and forth just to kind of get a feel for like how this will show up on the page. So I go through that, and then once I have that kind of like sample outline, proof of concept, visual design, then I usually go and try to write the whole rest of the thing, which takes anywhere from a week to a decade, depending on how I'm feeling. And then once I have that, gets sent off to the editor, and then I get that for feedback, and we go through the whole editing process. And then I usually take it into InDesign and I send it into graphic design from Google Docs. And oftentimes I'll give it like one last super fine proofreading pass there to make sure that any errors are caught. For Time After Time in particular, because the graphics involved are pretty complicated, it basically involved making I called it like the flat version, but essentially making like a version in InDesign that had all of the graphic design elements and all of the text, but none of the images, maps, or like overlaying graphic grossness stuff. The decay, we called it. And then I would export that dummy page that you like could play with, the flat page, as an image into Photoshop, and then would literally like hand draw over it. The art was done by my good friend Luck Isle, R. Devlin. So I'd bring Locke's art over, and then I occasionally a few pieces were mine, and then I would like hand draw in all of the textures and things. I say hand draw. I would bring them in from various texture maps and then modify them myself, and then get in there with my pen and alter them, and then add in more dust and grime and other effects, and then remove the flat layer from Photoshop and export that entire like sort of semi-transparent graphics layer back into InDesign as an image, which is just a horrible pipeline, and I wouldn't recommend it. But it does make some very like weird, cool interlaying, overlaying, interlocking effects that are hard to achieve otherwise.
Was that the pattern for all 80 pages?
Just about, yeah. I mean, I went through and did all 39 spreads, I guess it is, plus the 2 covers. Took forever. Also, why the book took so long. But yeah, it was. I mean, it really is my most involved, like back and forth InDesign Photoshop process that I've done on a project.
Do you have a favorite part of the process, whether it's the design, the Photoshop?
Yeah. I really enjoy. I really enjoy being done and exporting it, but I also really enjoy like oftentimes like my very first just sort of like basic block through graphic design of just looking through like, okay, how is this text going to fit on the page is cool, But then the most exciting part is that when I leave it for a week and come back later and I'm like, oh, now I know the things need to change. Now I can look and see what elements need to be modified. I can change this font. I can replace these blocks. I can shrink this. And like that first iteration of taking it from something that works, but is something that is like striking and cool, that's oftentimes the most exciting part.
Is there anything with Time After Time that you had to leave on the cutting room floor? Anything?
So much stuff. Yeah, there are tons. I mean, it got expanded and then it got cut down again. But there were like originally there was going to be a second spread full of NPCs that were like other factional stuff. There was going to be like, there were going to be originally like way more time devices. We had like tons of variations for each one that were all like very slightly different, but it got really unwieldy really fast of like having to look up subtly different things each time and my players were getting confused. I mean, there were drafts of pages where like some of the zones were originally way longer than they were, and then they just got cut down in editing because they weren't very good. Like I said, there was originally one version where like the timeline included tracking every single time device across the entire year-long cycle, and that was a nightmare and impossible to manage and impossible to design. So that got trimmed out, and we like left that hanging. I mean, every time I read any of my own books now, I look at them and I'm like, man, can only see the like 18 different things I want to change.
I think that's with anything you make. I'm a casual woodworker.
Oh, and cool.
So friends will say, "Hey, can you make me an end table or XYZ?" Sure, I'll make it, stain it, whatever, give it to them, and I'm like, "Well, just don't look at this corner here, the little." And they're like, "I never would have noticed."
Yeah. No, I find that's how it often is now. Of like, even my friends who are like experienced players, I hand the PDF to them and they're like, "Oh, it looks amazing. It's so good. It's so much fun." And I look at it and I'm like, "Oh, this is I can see so many grammatical errors I would change now. Like, oh man, this doesn't follow my most recent style guide." Like,
very funny.
Yeah. No, I'm like I find myself, one of my friends said or how did she phrase it? I don't know. I find myself being very restless with my work. I never am quite satisfied, and basically I publish it when I can't not publish it anymore. Of it's done or it needs to be done or I need to move on or whatever. Or the Kickstarter backers are yelling at me for a year and a half straight.
When did you go live with the Kickstarter?
February 2022. Yeah. Took about 2 years to finish. It was supposed to be 1 year and it was 2.
Well, I remember the update for the major rewrite, and hey, I'm sure obviously people were upset and they wanted it, on the timeline. But if you're gonna give more, that's fine.
Yeah. My main excuse is, it took twice as long as I planned, but it also turned out twice as long as I expected. So
yeah,
I'm sure there's value in there somewhere.
As a complete newbie to Kickstarter, I've never done a Kickstarter. What is the process involved with that?
Oh, well, making a Kickstarter is, first of all, I would recommend not doing it. But if you've decided to do one and you have it, the actual page itself is relatively straightforward to set up. It's basically just writing out what your project is and making some cool header images and making some art that all kind of fits together. But the work surrounding the Kickstarter is oftentimes the hardest part. If you're doing it properly, which I don't really think I've ever done in my life, but I know at least in theory, you basically write your entire thing and produce your entire thing ahead of time. So you have a relatively finished PDF that is more or less good to go. You make a large preview of that. And then for the entire duration of your campaign, particularly at the starts and end, you want to be on all the socials you can find. You want to be on Twitter. You want to be on Reddit. You want to be in Discord. You want to be on the forums. You want to be going on as many podcasts as you can get on. You want to be making your TikTok videos. You want to be doing all the socials as much as you can to push your Kickstarter as long as you can. And I think that increasingly, I'm just going to be like a little bit like a firebrand for a second in your podcast here and throw some hot takes at your audience. I think that increasingly Kickstarter is like a negative force in the RPG industry. I think that and I say this like partially as like a bitter creator who's made too many projects and is tired of it, but also like, I think that increasingly on a cultural level, I think on a cultural level, Kickstarter creates this weird situation in which artists and writers and designers are expected to be both really unique and brilliant, but also extremely personable, where they're supposed to be kind of broke, but also have all the resources of a corporation, where they're supposed to be able to behave like a corporation when it's appropriate and behave like an artist when it's appropriate, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And if you can't do that, then your backers get mad at you because there's a $500,000 licensed RPG with a PR team of 3 people who can do this full time. And I think on a material level, because Kickstarter is open to anyone, it means that there's a lot more competition. And it means that increasingly Kickstarter has moved from being what it set out to be, which was a crowdfunding platform of here, come and receive funding for a project that couldn't get another way, to basically just a pre-order store. Which comes with all the normal downsides of pre-orders, as any video game nerd can tell you, but also creates this weird like urgency FOMO effect of which if you're a backer, you're like, oh my God, like I have to back this project because I need my little bells and whistles. And also this company might not have enough money to produce the book, when clearly these companies have enough money to produce the books, but it makes a lot more sense to run a $500,000 pre-order campaign ahead of time, because why wouldn't you if you could do it? And so I recently have sort of sworn off Kickstarter. I don't plan on releasing any projects on Kickstarter in the future, and I haven't backed any projects on Kickstarter, I think, in the past year. I'm happy to buy your books after they release on Kickstarter. You know, DM me and I'll go buy one. But I increasingly am leery of using Kickstarter in particular, but any sort of crowdfunding platform as like a surrogate for a pre-order. And I think that's increasingly what they're becoming, and that worries me on a lot of different levels.
As just a small-time user on the platform, that does make a lot of sense to me. Kind of a dog and pony show, just to, especially for the bigger companies when they don't necessarily need it.
Right. Of like, you look when, I don't know, I'm just going to call it like Free League here, right? Free League, and when they run a Kickstarter, like they're clearly putting tens or even more, tens of thousands of dollars of key art and preview material and videos of like whatever. And like, sure, they make $1 million. Like it's worth it, an investment from their end as a business proposition. But in terms of like what Kickstarter says it is, these corporations are using it in a very different way. And that means that people who actually, like, I ran my first Kickstarter when I was like 20. I was like in college, and I made $1,500, and that let me buy some art for the front of my book and print some things on drive-through. And like, that was great. But like, that was a unique case because it was during Zine Quest. And so I think that like increasingly Kickstarter is hostile to what it claims its target audience and user base is.
Beyond Kickstarter, I am intimidated if I were to ever put anything on there. The fulfillment.
Oh, it's scary. Yeah.
I can't even. Okay, like give me money, so like I feel like I'm getting paid and rewarded for my time and effort putting in. But then actually having to ship international, I can't imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I've been very lucky of for both Time After Time and my sort of project running concurrently to it, Seas of Sand. On both of those, I ended up finding distributors, and so I basically just paid them a large lump sum of what I made on Kickstarter to handle all of that for me, which made the whole process a lot smoother and simpler. But yeah, I have done the like stuff zines into mailers in your basement for a weekend straight, and it's a rough time. It's not fun.
Yeah, that's how I imagine it, especially as a small time guy.
Yeah.
Well, if we've sworn that off, if you were to develop let's talk future projects. Anything you're working on that care to share for any system?
Always many things. The biggest one right now is I have a mega dungeon I'm working on for sort of old school OSR D&D-ish kind of thing. And the plan for it is to, in the spirit of not going Kickstarter, is to release the first few floors of it, probably the first 5 floors, which is something like between 400 and 500 rooms. And then those would go out, and with very simple layout, very basic layout, very basic maps, like no fancy production. And then over the next, I don't know, year or two, keep slowly releasing floors of, okay, it's a new month, or it's been a couple months, so I can release a couple more floors. And every time I release more floors, the price will go up. Luke Gearing, a friend of mine, did a very similar sort of scheme for his project Wolves Upon the Coast, which is now like $50 and huge. But when he started, it was like 10 and was like a small hex crawl that then ballooned. And so if you were smart and you bought it when it was $10, 2 years later, you have an amazing hex crawl. And if you didn't buy it back then, now you have to give Luke $50, which is what he deserves. Yeah, so that's the biggest one on the docket right now. And I have a few other small ones that may not see the light of day unless I don't really want to talk about yet.
Yeah.
But yeah, that Mega Dungeon is the biggest one that I'm working on right now.
Like I said, I'll link your itch account in there. But any projects you have that you feel are underappreciated?
Oh no, I mean, if anything, I feel like most of my projects are overappreciated. I mean, truthfully, the one I should be saying here is that everyone should go read my manifesto that I wrote. It's called New Simulationism. It's about how we play role-playing games and what the medium can afford us and what we're doing wrong, kind of. Very much in my like pretentious academic era, you know.
All right. Very cool. Being a professional DM, GM, tips for Mothership, tips for Dungeons and Dragons. New to the hobby, old to the hobby. What's something that you do that could make a table better?
Yeah, and I think this is true for any sort of like, not just like ones where people are paying you, but like this is, you know, I learned a lot of these things from like running games at shops, and other sort of like, or cons or clubs of things where it's not you and your friends in your kitchen, but rather kind of like an environment to go and do it. The things I have found is that, as much as I'm sometimes loath to say this, I think that it's increasingly important to, at these sort of smaller games, to not sweat the details of, in my home games, I make them all track carrying capacity, and I make them track like their store rations at their base, and I make them track all kinds of like details, because those details can really pay off a session or 5 from now. But I think in a one shot, especially for newbies, like it's much more important to just give them the tools they need to have fun and let them go. And then when they try to pick up the, you know, to use inventory as an example, if they try to pick up the grand piano, you can tell them they can't. Or if they try to carry 18 crowbars, you can tell them they can't. But in general, like let them go and let them use the tools they have as they go. And then that, I think that also on top of that, sort of along the same lines, like I'm a pretty staunch pro sandbox fan in my home game. So I let my players go where they want in the world map and kind of do what they want. And there's like, one of the things I tell them is that like nothing is forbidden and nothing is essential. There's nothing they have to do and there's nothing they really can't do. But I think in a one shot, especially for newbies, providing like a sharp direction is really useful. I think that, and there are modules that do this of like, this is the problem of this module. But I think it's easy in the kind of like, oh, it's our land to be like, wow, it's a sandbox, let them do whatever they want. But I find increasingly that with players who are there for, you know, 3 hours on an evening, like giving them a specific goal. If your goal is to steal the dragon's treasure, or your goal is to save the space station, or your goal is to find the murderer or whatever, giving them a specific pointed like game goal of like the thing they need to achieve in order to win is very helpful, because it gives them problems to solve. It gives them directions to face. They can roleplay if they want to, but they don't have to. You know, it offers more clear guidance. And I think that guidance is super helpful in a more structured kind of game.
Awesome. Not on my list of questions, but just thinking of this.
Yeah, please.
If there was one book, RPG, novel, whatever, that you thought you think would improve a table, what would you recommend?
Improve a table, or improve like you know, you're running with your friends and this is the book that will help your game, or this is the book to read if you want to make RPG content?
Let's say RPG content.
Great. The book you should read if you want to make RPG content is The Isle. It's written by Luke Gearing, edited by Jared Sinclair, and it's the book that changed my thinking the most about like what an RPG adventure is and how we can use them.
Awesome.
It's just a dungeon, but it's written with a structure and a clarity that I have never seen anywhere else, and it portrays a much more like holistic experience than I've seen. Like, it doesn't have an overview. One of the things I've noticed about RPG adventures, I'm sure you have, is they love to have overviews. They love to say like, this is what this adventure is about. You know, 5,000 years ago, when the Dark Lord Azkaban rose from the abyss, and something happened, and now there's dragons, right? And they oftentimes like tell you, the GM, the ending ahead of time. Mm-hmm. The Isle doesn't. When I got to the last page of The Isle, I, alone, reading it the night before the session, I literally gasped aloud in my room. I was shocked when I got to the last page. Like, I was invested in reading this dungeon, even though it's just a dungeon, but I really wanted to know, like, what was at the bottom? Like, what's down there? Like, what's on this island? And it, like, really gnawed at me. And then when I got to and discovered what it was, I immediately was like, oh, man, I should have seen this coming. And yet also I am shocked and horrified that this is what this is. So I think that if you want to write RPG books, I think that The Isle is the one that has like taught me the most about like what we can do with it on like a formal technical level.
Awesome. I have heard the name Luke Gearing before, but I often think he's the brother of Alan Girding.
No, he's not the brother of Alan Girding.
Two totally different people.
Yeah, Alan Girding is a psychology teacher, professor, or something like that, who makes board games, and Luke Gearing is like a bald, elusive English hermit who writes role-playing games.
Awesome. That seems like a complimentary description.
Yeah, yeah.
Perfect. Well, that's all I have.
Great.
In the end of the show, Hot Ones.
Sure.
What do you got going on? What would you like to promote?
Ooh, I would like to promote Time After Time, available at spearwitch.com/products/time-after-time. I would also like to promote my other new book, Seas of Sand, which is an old school toolbox setting guide about a vast ocean of liquid sand. Available at spacepenguin.ink/products/seas-of-sand. Both of those are available. If you're at Gen Con this year, I'll be there handing out more incendiary literature like I was last year, which people enjoyed for the most part. Otherwise, follow me on Twitter, twitter.com/headofthegoat. That's most of what I have to promote. Do you have anything you'd like to promote, Heath?
Nothing worth. It would all pale to all of your stuff. So it's nothing. All right, Sam Sorensen, I really appreciate your time.
Of course. Thank you for having me.